Hello, hope you're well. Um, this is the last video that I'm going to record for you. The last story I'm going to read to you. It's a bit sad, isn't it? It's the second time I'm recording this video. First time was outside in the garden, but it didn't work. So I thought I'd bring the fun in here. We haven't been in this room before. This is my room where I keep my records. Yeah, records like this. Bo Diddley in London. This was made before I was born. I think 1970, long time ago. 1973 or something like that. Here's another Bo Diddley. There's Bo Diddley on his motorbike. He obviously liked motorbikes. Bo Diddley is a blues artist. Right, story I'm going to read for you, Mr. Quiet by Roger Hargreaves. And this is a book that I would have read when I was about your age. It came out when I was 4 years old, 1974, when books cost 35p. These are all the other Mr. Men books. And I think that they later went on to write some Miss or Mrs. books as well. But this is Mr. Quiet, 1978. Mr. Quiet liked the quiet life. He lived quietly in a small little cottage in the middle of a wood. The problem was that small little cottage was in the middle of a wood, in the middle of a country called Loudland. Everything and everybody in Loudland was noisy. Oh, the noise. Dogs didn't go woof like dogs you know. They went woof. People didn't shut their doors like you or I would shut our doors. They slammed them. Bang! People didn't talk to each other. They shouted at each other. Hello! They'd shout as they met in the street. And you've heard about something being as quiet as a mouse, haven't you? Not in Loudland. They had the noisiest mice in the world. Squeak, squeak! They'd roar at each other. Mr. Noisy would have liked living in Loudland. He'd have loved it, but Mr. Quiet didn't. Noise frightened him, so he stayed in his cottage in the middle of his wood as much as he could. He's in bed hiding from the noise. But of course he couldn't stay there all the time. Every week, for instance, he had to go shopping. He used to creep into the grocer's shop. Good morning, bellowed the grocer. What can I do for you? Poor Mr. Quiet. He replied in a whisper. Please, he whispered, could I have some cornflakes, please? Speak up! Mr. Quiet tried his loudest whisper. Cornflakes! Can't hear you, shouted the grocer. Next, please. And poor Mr. Quiet had to creep away without any cornflakes. It wasn't fair, was it? He crept into the butcher's. Please, he whispered, I'd like some meat. The butcher didn't even hear him. He was humming to himself loudly and fiercely. Mr. Quiet tried again. Please, he whispered, I'd like some meat. The butcher started to whistle. It sounded more like a burglar alarm than a whistle. Mr. Quiet fled, empty-handed. It often happened, which probably explains why he was so little. Poor Mr. Quiet. He sat at home that night with the feeling of despair. Whatever am I to do? He thought. It's no use, he thought. I'll just have to try again. And so the following day he went shopping again. But the same thing happened. Can't hear you, thundered the grocer. Next, please. Can't hear you, bellowed the greengrocer. Next, please. Can't hear you, roared the milkman. Next, please. Can't hear you, boomed the butcher. Next, please. Oh dear. Poor Mr. Quiet went home and went to bed, hungry. The morning after, he was awakened by a noise which sounded like bombs dropping. It was the Loudland postman knocking at Mr. Quiet's door. Bang, 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 bang. Mr. Quiet went and opened the door. "Morning!" shouted the postman. "Letter for you." Mr. Quiet took the letter into his kitchen. He sat down to open it. He waited until the noise of the postman's footsteps died away. Clump, 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 clump. Mr. Quiet opened the letter in great excitement. He had never had a letter before. It was Mr. Happy in Happyland, an invitation to stay. Mr. Happy was overjoyed. He rushed upstairs and packed his bag and set off that very morning. It was late when he arrived on Mr. Happy's doorstep. He knocked on Mr. Happy's door. Tap, tap, tap. Mr. Happy opened the door. "Hello!" he smiled. "I thought I heard something. You must be Mr. Quiet. Well, don't just stand there. Come in and have some supper." It was the first proper meal Mr. Quiet had had for months, and while he was eating, he told Mr. Happy all about the problems he'd been having in Happyland. Mr. Happy was most sympathetic. Over breakfast the following morning, Mr. Happy told Mr. Quiet that he'd been thinking about his problem. "I think," he said, "that under the circumstances, you'd better stay here in Happyland." Mr. Quiet's face lit up. "And," continued Mr. Happy, "we'll find you a house. And," he went on, "a job." Mr. Quiet's face dropped. "I'm not very good at jobs," he confessed, "because I'm too quiet." "Ah," smiled Mr. Happy, "I have the very job for a quiet chap like you." And so the very next day Mr. Quiet started work, and he loves it. Do you know where he works? You think of where a quiet person would be good at working? Yep, in the Happy Lending Library. As you know, everybody who goes into a library has to be very quiet, and only whispering is allowed. What a clever idea of Mr. Happy, wasn't it? And these days Mr. Quiet is as happy as can be. Why, only the other day, do you know what he did on his way home from work? He was so happy he laughed out loud. Can you imagine? Tee-hee-hee! Next, please. It's a good one, isn't it? Mr. Quiet. Classic series of books from the 1970s. Mr. Strong, Mr. Fussy, Mr. Jelly, Mr. Daydream, Mr. Lazy, Mr. Impossible, Mr. Noisy, Mr. Chatterbox, Mr. Forgetful, Mr. Tickle, Mr. Sneeze, Mr. Bounce, Mr. Funny, Mr. Small, Mr. Uppity, Mr. Happy, Mr. Mean, Mr. Greedy, Mr. Silly, Mr. Bump, Mr. Dizzy, Mr. Snow, Mr. Muddle, Mr. Mischief, Mr. Worry, Mr. Skinny, Mr. Wrong, Mr. Messy, Mr. Tall, Mr. Nosy, Mr. Topsy-Turvy, Mr. Grumpy, Mr. Clumsy, Mr. Nonsense, Mr. Clever, Mr. Slow, Mr. Busy, Mr. Quiet, and Mr. Rush. And there must be more than that now, because I know they started making them with Miss or Ms. Very good. So, over the summer holidays, who are you going to be? You going to be Mr. Loud or Miss Messy? No. You're going to be. You can choose who you're going to be. Maybe it's going to be Mr. Busy, or Ms. Helpful, or Mr. Kind. Who am I going to be? I'm going to be Mr. Lazy. I'm going to have a nice, relaxing, lazy holiday. But I'll be missing you guys. It's been a real pleasure working with you this year. You've all done really well, learned lots, and been really well behaved for me. So I want to thank you. And going to still see each other around when you're in year 2. I'll still be in year 1. So when you see me, you can say hello. And you have a great summer. Make sure you're helpful and kind and well behaved for your parents, yeah? And stay well and stay sensible. Remember things that we've talked about, staying safe. Okay? Take care then. Bye-bye.